Hello, welcome to Plain Mundane Show. This is Alex. Today we're going to talk about the ego. We're going to talk about the obliteration of one's self-identity, and you'll see what that means, and the process of what people call enlightenment or further light, uh, which I don't use those terms anymore. I used to say those words, but they mean something else to me now, as far as going down a Gnostic or an esoteric or mystical path. Whereas if you just become aware of something, or somebody clues you into something, or you suddenly see something differently, just like think of the birds and the bees or Santa Claus, uh, you just have a whole different perspective on the program as who you are today than what you did before you knew more about the topics. It's not like the topics are changed or they weren't true completely, but maybe presented in formats that you could either understand or that would protect you at your level of development, as was perceived by your guardians or parents. So, what is the ego? Okay, death is a word that we humans usually associate with darkness, mourning, decay, and general creepiness. We spend our entire lives running away from, avoiding, and denying the fact that someday we will physically die. However, the death that we'll be talking about in this article isn't the typical kind of death we fear. It's the most beautiful and precious, illuminating, awe-inspiring, expansive, enlightening, paradigm-shattering experience you could ever go through. This experience is known as ego death. And for every serious spiritual seeker, it is a pivotal process to go through. What is the ego? In order to understand what the ego death is, we must first understand what the ego is. As we elaborated on in this article, what is the ego? The ego is basically our sense of self or our identity. The ego is a biological and spiritual tool that was created by and defends the belief that we are all separate individual entities. As a result of believing that, I'm flipping too fast. As a result of believing that we are separate and isolated in this life, we suffer immensely. The ego perceives life through the lens of duality. Duality is the opposite of reality. It is the division of life into opposing forces such as love, hate, good, bad, right, wrong, holy, sinful. When we divide life, we suffer. The result of the dualistic ego is judgment, hatred, condemnation, and alienation. While we accept some things, we reject other things. While we love some people, we hate other people. Instead of unconditionally accepting life in its wholeness, we segregate it into acceptable and unacceptable experiences, people, beliefs, thoughts, and emotions. Thus we suffer. As a result of our perceived separation from spirit and the duality lens we see life through, we also begin to reject ourselves. Any thought, feeling, sensation, experience, or belief we have that is judged to be bad, unacceptable, or wrong, we suppress, avoid, and deny. As a result of this repression, we fuel our shadow selves, which become more twisted, angry, and perverted the more we lock away. The product of living through the ego can be observed in our world very clearly. The depression, anxiety, mental illness, murder, hatred, greed, poverty, war, and environmental destruction we experience is all a reflection of our internal suffering. Our internal suffering is solely the product of the ego that believes it is separate from others and life itself. What is ego death? Really, the ego can never really die. Instead, it can be transcended and made conscious so that it's no longer running our lives. So how can we define ego death? Ego death is the experience of transcending the ego, self, or identity. This experience is the most mind-bending, awakening, awe-inspiring, peaceful, and unconditionally loving experience you could ever have. Ego death is essentially an experience of embodying your true nature completely, or returning back to who you really are, temporarily. However, while the experience of ego death is indescribably beautiful, it can also be indescribably horrific for those who are not aware of the spiritual path and for those who resist the actual experience. That's really well stated right there. That's two groups of people that we see a lot, that I see. People who are not aware of the spiritual path and those who resist the actual experience. Run into those people every day, don't we? Those who report ego death generally fall into two groups: those who found the experience illuminating and those who found the experience tormenting. I've experienced both states of pure ecstasy and pure horror. If you're familiar with the psychonaut community, the collection of people who use psychedelic substances to access higher states of being, then you would have heard many ego death experiences. because the shamanic plants like ayahuasca, DMT, and psilocybin mushrooms are powerful gateways to the divine experience. Terence McKenna once said, "You make the commitment and then nature will respond to that commitment by removing impossible obstacles. Dream the impossible dream and the world will not grind you under. It will lift you up. This is the trick." This is what all these teachers and philosophers who really counted, who really touched the alchemical gold, this is what they understood. This is the shamanic dance in the waterfall. This is how magic is done. By hurling yourself into the abyss and discovering it is a feather bed. Ego death can feel scary, but it's actually the ultimate threat to the ego. Complete loss of self, if only for a minute. As a defense mechanism, the ego creates intense fear. However, in order to progress on our spiritual path, we must understand the role of this fear and be mindful of it and not permit it to limit us. 7 stages of ego death. Okay? Ego death happens in stages, and if courageously pursued, results in the experience of nirvana, oneness, and enlightenment. Stage 1, spiritual awakening, the first stage of ego death. As we begin to wake up to life, our process of spiritual awakening might be triggered by existential crisis, a tragedy, a chronic illness, or simply the natural process of soulful maturing. When we experience a spiritual awakening, we begin to search more for the depth in life. Often we ask big questions such as, what's my purpose, what is the meaning of life, and what happens after death? Spiritual awakenings are triggered by the sensation that something profound is missing in life and are accompanied by the feelings of depression and anxiety. You can learn more about the spiritual awakening process in our book. The dark night of the soul is inseparable from spiritual awakening process. When we experience the dark night, we become extremely conscious of our separation from ourselves, other people, and the divine. The dark night of the soul is a period when we feel utterly lost, lonely, and isolated from others. It is the accumulation or culmination of our suffering. Deep down, we know something has to drastically change in our life, but we don't know what or where to look. Stage 3, the spiritual seeker. Eventually, after experiencing a spiritual awakening and dark night of the soul, we stumble into the field of spirituality. We start experimenting with different spiritual practices and find that some alleviate our suffering. We become obsessed with reducing the suffering we've been carrying and explore many different fields such as energy, healing, Zen, yoga, astrology, mysticism, etc. This was me back in like 2007 through 2012. Stage 4, Satori. Satori is a Zen Buddhist word that means momentary enlightenment. Satori is a small glimpse into your true nature or consciousness itself, a moment when your ego is completely shed. For some, this experience is scary and spiritual growth stagnates. For others, it is deeply life-changing and spiritual growth continues. Stage 5, the Elder Soul. After a certain period of time, we begin to develop spiritual discernment. We discover the gimmicks and spiritual bypassing practices that keep us trapped in the cycle of pain, fear, and separation, and learn practices that open us to the divine. As we begin to experience more and more soulful maturity, we learn the virtues of self-discipline, patience, and focus. Stage 6, dissolution and deconstruction. In this stage, we begin to surrender all that we are not. This stage is not just about identifying our destructive and limiting beliefs and behavior patterns, but actually letting them go and letting the light in. Grace, discipline, trust, courage, non-attachment, love all play an important role in this process. Stage 7, the end of the search. Finally, we come to a stop. We realize all that we are, all that we need can be found right now. The search to become something, to lose something, to find something, and to accomplish something perish. We see through the illusion of looking for truth, joy, peace, and love in any place outside of ourselves. We see the truth that we are mirrored in all beings and all things. While the ego still exists, we become aware of the ego simply a tool and not the truth of who we are. Transcending duality and the grip of the ego, we develop the capacity to give unconditional love and acceptance. This is the state of ultimate inner peace, freedom, and what people refer to as enlightenment. Yet those who experience this know that no possible label or mental construct can encapsulate such an experience. Ego death is a serious, purging, profound, and shattering experience. It is so deep and so beyond anything we have experienced in this life that it changes your perception of existence in a single moment. I hope these stages have helped you to understand it better. Finally, I'll leave you with the beautiful quote to ponder about death itself. Death is a stripping away of all that is not you. The secret life is to die The secret of life is to die before you die and to find that there is no death. I think I'm getting there, folks. Pretty close through all these steps. There's a lot of truth in this. You can think of a lot of examples, I'm sure, going through your mind as I read that. But thank you for coming to Plain Mundane Show. Please hit like, subscribe, ring the bell, and just wait till I put out my next video.